especially for Indians, right? When you buy a home, it's, we show our friends, our parents are proud of us, and all that is an emotion, right? So there are moving costs because you have to do movers, you have to pack your stuff, it's a cost that you pay for paying less than 20% down payment. And you want to rent forever, make sure that we are not retiring in Canada or we continue to work even after 67, which is probably not possible for a lot of people because that $80,000 is worth a lot more if you invest in S&P 500. You're paying an additional $35,400 in just mortgage default insurance, including the interest on it. Buying is a lot more complicated. I did buy a property. I continue to buy real estate, but just from a cash flow point of view, you are going to pay at least $100 more by simply buying the same house that you were renting. Renting is paying someone else's mortgage, and all you need to do to buy a home is collect 5% down payment. This statement cannot be further from truth, and in today's video we are going to talk about the real cost of home ownership. So let's get started. Now, if you are new to this channel, my name is Navjot and I'm on a mission to retire 1 million immigrants with $5 million. And for you to join this mission, all you need to do is hit the subscribe button, and I promise you I'll come up with really amazing videos that will make you a lot of money. In today's video, we are going to talk about the rent versus buy. Now, I did make an entire video. I have a calculator. I'll link it again in the description. I'll also link the video in the description. Go through that video. It's a 25-minute video, but it gives a lot of calculations with calculator on renting versus buying, and you can actually just, customize that calculation to your liking as well and to your rents and buying decisions as well. We'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll talk about it's more than just down payment. What I mean by that is it's not just the down payment that you require. There's mortgage default insurance if you're doing a less than 20% down. There's closing costs. There's opportunity cost of putting that down payment into the stock market. That's an opportunity cost that you lose, right? And then there is also hidden costs that we'll talk about in this video. And finally, I did buy a property. I continue to buy real estate. And then the last video, I had some people talk in the comments that then why are you buying a property? And I'll talk about my reasons why, knowing that owning a home is way more than down payment and there are other costs involved that no one talks about, I still want to invest into my home. We'll talk about that and more in today's video. Let's talk about renting versus buying and do a little bit of calculation. Now, let's assume that you are renting a home. These are real numbers. If you were to rent my home, the townhouse that I have, I recently sold that townhouse, but that townhouse would rent for about $3,000, maybe a little bit less, right now, but let's say $3,000, for comparison right now. Utilities for that townhouse are between $250 to $300, let's say $300, and insurance, which is the tenant insurance because you're renting, that will be about $60 for this home. It could be a little bit high, but let's say $60 for now. So the total expenses of this house comes to about $3,350, and if anything breaks in this house because I'm renting, I'm actually not responsible for the breakage, and I can simply go to the landlord and they'll pay for that maintenance. Buying is a lot more complicated. First of all, corresponding to the rent, which a lot of people say, okay, you are paying rent, let's pay mortgage. That's just the beginning, and that's also a higher number. So the mortgage on this particular house, let's assume it sells for about, or you buy it for about $825,000. That's what I sold my townhouse for. And you do a 10% down payment on this, and the mortgage payment would come out to about $4,000. Now, I've taken a slightly lower interest rate because I'm doing a long-term calculation of the next 25 years, and therefore I've taken a long-term interest rate of 4%. Right now, the interest rates are closer to 4.75% depending on the down payment, your credit, a lot of factors related to your profile. But let's assume we are taking a long-term interest rate of 4%. The mortgage payment will be $4,000, $4,041. Utilities will remain the same, $300, because irrespective of whether you own or rent, you still pay the utilities. Insurance increases because now you need to pay for fire damage as well. It's not just your belongings in the house, your laptops and everything that you need to pay for. So insurance increases to about $125. Then you also have property tax that you need to pay, which the landlord was paying when you were renting. So that's about another $300. These are real property taxes for my home. And then you have maintenance because if anything breaks, you are responsible because it's your house now, and therefore let's add another $200 a month. It could be a little bit higher. We'll talk about that, in a bit as well. And the total expenses come out to just shy of $5,000. So just from a cash flow point of view, and I'll talk about the principal and everything, in a bit. But just from a cash flow point of view, you are going to pay at least $1,600 to $1,700 more by simply buying the same house that you were renting. Now, of course, you can take a very different path of if you are renting in Ontario, you move to Calgary, and therefore this difference will be a lot lower, and that would be smart. But not everyone can do it, and therefore I'm not taking that assumption here. All I'm assuming is you're actually buying the same home that you were renting. Now, the mortgage payment of $4,000 is not all expense. There is a principal component, there's an interest component. If we assume long term, you pay 35% principal. Now, long term, obviously, this 35% principal will start to increase and you'll pay a lot more principal as you pay your mortgage down. But let's assume that in the beginning, you are paying 35% towards principal and the rest 65% is going towards interest. Now, principal is not expense, and that's actually your equity that you are building. And therefore, you deduct that equity from the total expenses of $4,900. And you come up with $3,500. That's the real expense that you have. So when someone says that renting is paying someone else's mortgage, I do not completely agree with them, because if you see in this example, you are actually paying $200 more in expenses. I'm not even talking about principal here. Only the expenses, including the interest payment and the property tax and the maintenance and insurance, than if you were renting. Now, there is a case to be made that I'm not counting appreciation in this particular calculation, because this is only monthly numbers. And if the property appreciates, if you are renting, you actually don't get any of that appreciation, and it's a landlord who actually gets all the appreciation. And that I agree. But buying a property is more than this particular slide and the appreciation. And let's talk about that as well, because the maths is not as simple as we think it is. Number one thing that we'll talk about from a cost point of view is if you do a less than 20% down, you have to pay mortgage default insurance, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We'll talk about the closing costs that a lot of people forget. When we are buying a house, there are closing costs involved. We'll talk about that as well. There are opportunity costs, because if you have a down payment of, let's say, $100,000, you have an option of putting the down payment on a home, or you can actually put that $100,000 in the stock market, and therefore you'll get liquidity and you'll get a certain amount of growth as well. And we'll talk about that as well. And fourth are some hidden costs that I'll talk about in the end, because these are costs that we actually would never know if we never own a home. I'll talk about those costs as well. Let's talk about mortgage default insurance. It's popularly known as CMHC insurance, but it's actually mortgage default insurance. And this is something that you pay. It's a cost that you pay for paying less than 20% down payment. And the reason why you pay this is because you're doing a less than 20% down payment, there is more risk involved in this particular mortgage, and the bank wants to make sure that if you're not able to pay off the mortgage, they at least get paid off. And that's the reason why you are paying the premium on behalf of the bank, to protect the bank, not you. The insurance company will still come after you. It's not like you are off the hook if you don't pay the mortgage, but it just protects the bank and we pay the price for it. Let's talk about the calculation here. So let's say you are purchasing a home for $800,000. The down payment is about 10%. That's what you do. Let's say $80,000. The loan amount is $720,000 on a 4% interest rate. Again, I'm doing long-term numbers. Let's not go into the comments and say, oh, the interest rates are much higher. That's fine. I understand. We are doing long-term numbers here. Overall, the interest rates are less than 4% across 25 years. So on 4% interest rate, the mortgage payment will be just shy of $3,800. But that's not the loan amount that you are actually taking from the bank, because what we are also doing is we are adding a default insurance, which is the mortgage default insurance on top of this. And the calculation there is if you're doing a 10% down payment, it's 3.1% of the loan amount. So 3.1% of $720,000 is $22,320, and you can actually borrow this money from the bank itself. And therefore, the new loan amount that that you are taking is $720 plus $22,320. Which is equal to $742,320. And if you subtract this and this, 800 and 742, that's the amount of equity that you own in the home to start with. The mortgage payment, therefore, has now increased because we are taking on more loan. If we include the default insurance into it, it's $3,905, which is an entire $118 more in this particular calculation. If you multiply 118 by 12 months into 25 years, so in 25 years, you are paying an additional $35,400 in just mortgage default insurance, including the interest on it. So yes, there's an additional cost that you are paying. It's $35,000. We'll talk about whether it's more or less, because we need to have a point of comparison there. The total interest plus mortgage default insurance that you pay in 25 years is $451,500. So if you're buying a $800,000 house, doing a 10% down payment, the overall interest plus expenses that you have across 25 years is about $450,000. Now, I understand that $450,000 is a lot of money, and you'll be paying about $1.15 million for the $800,000 house that you buy, but the house worth will be a lot more in 25 years. It will be close to $2 to $2.5 million. and therefore it more than pays off for the additional interest that you pay. That's not the reason why you don't buy, right? So I just wanted to make that clear. Let's say that you do not want to pay the mortgage default insurance because you don't want to incur the $35,000 cost that you have, and you want to wait to save the $160,000, which is 20%, and therefore you can avoid the mortgage default insurance. The problem is that if you wait, then there is no guarantee that you can still buy this home for $800,000. So yes, you will wait, to save for 20% down payment, but there's a very high chance that the purchase value will be higher than $800,000, and therefore you would end up paying the same amount of mortgage payment or the same amount of interest eventually, because now you're buying the home at a higher price. Now let's assume that doesn't happen. The market remains the same. We are able to save for $160,000. We are able to do the 20% down payment, and we take a loan of $640,000, which is 80% of the overall purchase value. And in that case, the total interest and the mortgage default insurance, which is $0 in 25 years, will be $370,000. So you save an entire $80,000 in interest and fees across 25 years if you save $160,000 instead of putting down $80,000. However, let's assume you had $160,000 and you still decided to only put $80,000 down and pay the mortgage default insurance, and the remainder of $80,000 you actually put in S&P 500 for 25 years, and the year-on-year return is 8%. The worth of this $80,000 without putting any new money will be over $500,000, and therefore it absolutely makes sense to do a lower down payment when you have it, when you are ready. The only reason why you do a higher down payment or save for higher down payment is because you are a single family earner and you need your mortgage payments to be as low as possible, or you're actually not stretching a lot by doing 20% down. You have much more money than the 20% that is required, and you do a 20% down. Do not stretch to the last dollar. Do not eat into your emergency fund when buying a home just to do the 20% down, because the math actually doesn't work in that favor. You only save about $80,000 in this particular example if you do not pay the mortgage default insurance and you actually pay the 20% down payment, and that I think is not worth it, because that $80,000 is worth a lot more if you invest in S&P 500. All this said, mortgage default insurance is one cost that you still need to incur, and that's something that we need to take care of. The second one that I wanted to talk about is closing costs. And let's say that the purchase price of this particular house, which is my house that I purchased for, is $635,000. Now I did a 20% down payment, but I want to do the calculation on 10% down payment because there are certain costs, and that's the most common down payment that I see because I do a lot of first time home buyers. So let's assume that we do a 10% down payment so that I can explain you all the costs that you will incur at less than 20% down payment. The land transfer tax is the biggest cost that you pay. Like in India, we had registration. Same way here we have land transfer tax, and that's about $85.50. This is different for different cities. This is different for different homes. Mine was a pre-construction home, so it can be different for you. But let's take my example. These are actually real numbers. I actually took my ledger that I got from the lawyer, and I've put the exact numbers here. So land transfer tax that I paid was $8,550. Now this was not my first home, but if this was my first home, the land transfer tax rebate that you get in Ontario is $4,000, and therefore your net land transfer tax will be lower at $4,550 because of the rebate. Other charges are legal charges, which is about $2,000. This includes software fee, the lawyer fees, all that. Let's say about $2,000. Mine was around that only. Registration of transfer is $82. It's not a lot. Registration of charge is $82. These are all costs that the lawyer incurs as is. They actually pay the government and they just charge you. That's $82 again. There's a title insurance that you need to buy. I've talked about this in many of my videos. This is a mandatory thing that you need to do if you are taking a mortgage, and that's another $157. Now it has increased this year. I've heard that it's about $200 to $250, but let's take what I have on my ledger. And the final cost, and this is something that I did not know until I became a mortgage agent, was that if you do a less than 20% down payment, you do pay a mortgage insurance, but you also need to pay tax on that insurance, and that tax needs to come from your closing costs. So the mortgage insurance overall, the $22,000 that we talked about in the previous slide, that gets added on to the mortgage. However, you still need to pay the tax on that mortgage insurance upfront, and that tax in Ontario is not 13% because overall the sales tax is 13%, but you only pay the provincial portion of that tax, which is 8%, and 8% of $22,000 is about $1417. So all these costs taken together is about $8,300, and that accounts to about 1.3%. You should buffer about 1.5 to sometimes about 2%, but 1.5% is kind of where you'll land if you are a first-time home buyer and buying in GTA. Now let's talk about the third kind of cost, which is the opportunity cost of buying a home versus renting a home. So let's talk about renting first. Let's say you're renting a home for $3,000 a month. You invest the down payment. Let's say you were making $100,000 of down payment to buy this particular home at $825,000. I'm including the down payment of 10%, plus I'm also including the closing cost. Let's say that's about $100,000, and you invest that into S&P 500 on day one. You don't buy the home, you actually take the entire $100,000 and you invest in S&P 500 and you keep that money for the next 25-30 years. Plus, because there's a difference between your rent and your overall house owning cost on a monthly basis, and that difference will be about $1,500 to $1,600, you invest that difference into S&P 500 also. So if you do both of these things, you invest the down payment and closing cost, plus you invest the difference of owning versus renting every single month for the next 25 years. And this I'm including the rent to increase by about 2.5 to 3% every single year. I'm actually counting that as well. If you account for that, and I'll show you the calculator and how it's done, the stock portfolio that you'll have in the next 30 years, which is at 67, will be over $2 million. And I've taken an 8% year-on-year return on your stock portfolio. So that's the stock portfolio that you have. That's the opportunity cost that you have of not putting the $100,000 in the S&P 500 and instead buying your own home. However, your rent at the age 67, because you don't own a home, therefore, and you're not mortgage free, you still need to pay rent. And if you're retiring in Canada, the rent at 3% increase every single year for the next 30 years will be $7,000. And that's a lot of rent, especially when your active income at 67 will be zero. So if you are to go with this particular calculation and you want to rent forever, make sure that we are not retiring in Canada or we continue to work even after 67, which is probably not possible for a lot of people. Now let's talk about buying the mortgage and not investing in S&P 500, that down payment that we have. The starting mortgage expense will be about $4,600. This includes everything. No investing for 25 years. Mortgage free in 25 years because we are not investing in anything. We are just investing into our own home. We are paying off the mortgage, and we are mortgage free in 25 years. And we start to invest in the stock market at like 25 years from now for the next 5 years till the time we are working. The stock portfolio at age 67, because at 62 we became mortgage free. For the next 5 years we actually invested into the stock market, and the stock portfolio is now under $400,000. It's not massive. It's not worth a lot in 30 years, honestly, with inflation. But let's assume that's the number that we have, because that's the number that we have. However, you have equity in your home, which is about $2.5 million. But the problem with this equity is that it's locked into your home, and you'll always need your home if you want to live in Canada. And therefore, you can't pull out a lot of equity from here. If you pull, you again need to pay more into mortgage. Now, the good thing is that your home expenses at 67 will only be property taxes, maintenance, and all that, stuff. That's about $1,300. So you don't have to pay $7,000 a month in rent, especially again, when you have your active income at zero. So I like the second scenario a little bit better. However, what I don't love about this is I have very little liquidity. I don't understand how I can live in a $2.5 million house. Yes, my expenses are lower. My active income is zero, and I do not have any investments to fall back upon to cover for my retirement, because I don't know about you, but I want to live a very, very long life. And in order to do that, I'll require money to survive. So yes, there is opportunity cost of buying a home that you are not investing in the S&P 500. You can have a portfolio of $2.1 million, and that absolutely works if you don't want to retire in Canada. However, if the goal is to retire in Canada, I feel that we have to have a mix of both the things. We have to invest our money into the stock market. And if that means that we actually have less disposable income to buy a smaller home, that's okay. But I would do both the things in order to have both the levers working for me at retirement. I would want a $2 to $3 million worth of stock portfolio, as well as I will require a mortgage-free house so that my monthly expenses are not very high from a shelter point of view. I know this was very, very crazy math, but I'll keep it light in the next two slides. We talk about the hidden costs now. There are moving costs because you have to do movers, you have to pack your stuff, you have to do a U-Haul if you're doing it yourself, you have to buy boxes to pack everything up. All that costs money, and you need to budget about $500 to $1,000 if you're moving homes. You also need to budget for maintenance and repairs. I think a lot of people don't do that. You have to, like, let's say, so my home is about 1,800 square feet. Now 1,800 square feet, I will budget at least $1,800 per year So that's $1 per square feet per year, or up to 1% of my purchase price. So for me, it'll be about $1,800 per year, all the way to about $6,000 per year. It can land anywhere in between this, depending on how old your house is, because the older the house is, the more maintenance it might require. So make sure that you are budgeting anywhere between, let's say, a 2,000 square feet house, anywhere between $2,000 to about $8,000 a year in maintenance in case a big expense comes up. Now it will be closer to $2,000. Let's hope that. But again, have that into accounting. When you're moving a home, like we moved from a condo to a 3-bedroom townhouse, we had to buy a bed, we had to buy new furniture, because it's a new home, we want to make memories, we want to buy furniture, we want to make it look nice, we want to invite our friends, we don't want the same IKEA, dining table that we had, you have some wants, right? And it's okay. So obviously, but that's something that you need to budget for. And I say swad anusar, it depends on, what you like, and it can be a few $1,000s to hundreds and thousands of dollars of furniture. It just depends on what you want to do, but that's something that you also need to budget for. And this is the fourth thing that people do not take care of at all. I was living in Etobicoke before we bought a house. Now in Etobicoke, my commute was very little. Everything was around. And then I moved to Kitchener and my commute increased. So there was increased travel time, and time is money. And you might incur more car payment, because let's say you are living in downtown, you don't own a car. Now you're living a little bit further and you need a car, and that car payment plus the petrol bill plus, everything else that comes with a car, like the maintenance and everything, the winter tires, all that also adds up. And we need to make sure that we are counting that into our expenses or in our cash flow before we make a decision of buying a home. So these are all the hidden costs that I wanted to mention here. These are very important to take care of. Now, finally, I would want to finish this by telling you why I still want to buy a home. And there are 4 reasons for it. Number 1 is lack of stability in a rental property. Now, we don't have kids, but let's say we do have kids, or people with, kids right now. You would want your kids to be going to the same school. You would not want to uproot them of their, school that they are going into. You would not want to uproot them of the friend circle that they have. And that's the stability that you get when you buy a home, because you can actually take the decision of keep living in that home, and you are not, dependent on the landlord keeping the home, or not, wanting for you to leave, or, them not wanting to move into the home, and therefore you have to be displaced into another rental property. All that is a reality of living in a rental. And if you're okay with that, don't buy. But I am not okay with that. The second one is I really want to retire in Canada, and therefore I want to be mortgage and rent free on retirement so that my monthly expenses are not very high. And that's the reason why I bought a smaller home as my first home, because I did not want to sacrifice on my stock investing budget. I still invest $2,000. I used to invest $2,000 earlier as well. And I still continue to invest a minimum of $2,000 in my stock portfolio, so that I still have a sizable stock portfolio in the next 25 to 30 years. And I have a mortgage free home. So you have to strike that balance. And I really want a mortgage free home when I retire. The third one is the emotion of owning a home and making it, a place where you can actually make memories. And that's something that I would love to do. When you buy a home, it's an emotion, especially for Indians, right? When you buy a home, it's, we show our friends, our parents are proud of us, and all that is an emotion, right? So I think, saying that, no, you should absolutely not buy a home because the numbers don't make sense. Sometimes when you're buying your own home, numbers doesn't always have to make sense. What needs to make sense is your situation. What needs to make sense is whether you can afford to make those payments or not, because then there's no going back. So yes, the third one is more emotional and less numbers, which is contrary to everything that I talk about usually in my videos. But that's the reality. That's life, right? And the fourth one is I really want my portfolio to be diversified, because if I only invest into the stock market and that's the only vehicle that I have, yes, I'll have more liquidity, but I have less diversification. If Elon Musk says something and the stock market declines, I can't do much about it. But I always have something to fall back upon, my primary home, which has equity. And therefore, I would want diversification to be part of my mix. And that's another reason why you should buy. Plus, when you buy a home, your capital gain tax when you sell that home and let's say move to India is $0. But in a stock portfolio, now, unless you only do TFSA, but the size of investment that I'm talking about, you'll probably have to do normal investing as well. When you sell those stocks, you'll have to incur tax. And that's where I feel that the diversification, both from a tax point of view and from overall, health of the portfolio point of view, it's very important. That's all I have for today. I hope I was able to put some color on what all expenses that you need to incur when buying a home. It's not just down payment, contrary to what people have to say, there are so many other things that you need to take care of. And I hope I was able to make a video that could answer all your questions. Now, if you have watched till here, you can book a free call from the description below and have your situation talk to an agent in my team. And we'll love to help you in your home buying journey if that's the decision that you take. That's all I have for today. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए bye bye.